Hi folks, today we're talking about divorce, remarriage, and blended families. And to begin, we need to talk about some trends involving each of these. First, really looking ultimately for the entirety, at least, of the chapter with respect to divorce. Keep in mind that divorce, one trend is that it's exemplary, it's an example of family diversity. So when we're talking about divorce, we're also talking about conventional families, blended families, cohabiting kinds of families, lesbian and gay marriages, as well as multiple marriage circumstances and situations. Also, another trend is that divorce magnifies social inequality, as educated, wealthier families are less likely to divorce. And we'll talk about those trends in a few ways going further with respect to the chapter. Also, divorce reflects social change in the locus of decision making. And so, a lot of the decision making that we have in our society ultimately reflects the, in a sense, expansion of choice and expansion of opportunity for individuals. And so, in a lot of respects, the desire to divorce is tied to an expansion of individual choice and decision making. And also, it's tied to parallel limits on government and religious units' ability to regulate such choices and decisions. So, in addition to those trends, we also, I should say, have to look at the social history of divorce in the United States as well. And we can start with the colonial period going into the 19th century, the 1800s. With the exception of Native American nations and tribes, customs and laws concerning divorce greatly discouraged and restricted the practice. In fact, those granted a divorce during this time were profoundly discouraged from remarrying. However, progressive views concerning women's equality pressed divorce as essential to women's rights. And from that period going into the 20th century and certainly into the present, divorce rates have risen steadily. They rose steadily, especially in the early 1900s, in a way that was consistent with the gains in women's equality, such as suffrage or with the suffrage movement, then dropping dramatically during the Great Depression. However, during the Great Depression, desertion and domestic violence within families that rose sharply as well. Also, I should say after the Great Depression, divorce rates rose and they also fell dramatically. So there's been sort of a back and forth, uh, in large part in response to the changing legal and social changing aspects with respect to divorce and society. No fault divorce, civil rights, and the recent emergence of peer marriage. So we can think of the peer marriage period that we have today as involving marriages based on best friendships, shared goals, hobbies, lifestyles, and personal qualities. And so we tend to see those come together for spouses and for married couples today versus in the past. We also can measure divorce and divorce trends in a number of different ways. One of the ways we can do this is through what we call the refined divorce rate. So this is really looking at the number of divorces per 1,000 married couples. And so arguably, this is the best way to demonstrate the risk of divorce for all married couples, regardless of when they actually got married. Again, we'll talk about this a couple of times, that those who've married more recently, they're less likely to have a marriage that ends in divorce. So currently the refined divorce rate, so again we're looking at the number of divorces per 1,000 married couples, is 16 divorces per 1,000 couples, or 1.6%. So again, that's a way to sort of control for the unique risk factors that each couple has with respect to their own marriage, possibly potentially ending in divorce. And again, this leads directly into the cohort effects. And so we know that divorce is much more common among couples of certain age groups and cohorts. And so divorce, the risk of it is much more common among couples married prior to 1970, when peer marriage trends became more evident and began to have an impact, especially amongst those who have college degrees. Those who married since, again, 1970 are also more likely to marry at a later age in life, and that's a trend that tends to make marriages more stable. Also, the data suggests with this that the weaker relationships are much less likely to become marriages today, and that they are ending long before marriage becomes a consideration. Also, in terms of education and social class, divorce is considerably less common amongst those with a 4-year degree or more, and It's also less common amongst those who are middle class or higher. This reflects the greater social advantage of such couples and how much marriage is ultimately tied to maintaining those said advantages. In terms of race and ethnicity, with the exception of Asian Americans, people of color have higher divorce rates than whites, particularly Native Americans, African Americans, and Latinos or Latinx folks. We've talked about this in prior chapters, that there's greater cultural, economic, and social vulnerability among communities of color, and so that explains the higher risk of divorce of those same communities. There are some additional trends and risk factors for divorce as well. Uh, One includes marrying prior to age 25, as well as getting remarried. So both of those are associated with a greater risk of divorce once married. Divorce does bring about some consequences, and they're often not talked about or stressed enough, and so I want to make sure that we go through these clearly. In terms of divorce consequences, health is one of the most profound of these. So, research by the sociologist Linda Waite determines that divorced people have 20% more chronic health conditions, such as diabetes, heart disease, or cancer, than do married folks. And also, the divorced have 23% more mobility limitations. And so, say for instance, climbing stairs. So, they are much more likely to have mobility limitations than those who have intact marriages. So, Waite found that these health consequences persist after remarriage. So, this really suggests that the stress of divorce may be a causal factor in the development of negative health conditions. Also, sociologist Mark Hayward determined that divorced middle-aged women were 60% more likely to have cardiovascular disease than their married counterparts. However, while remarriage does not erase the health declines completely, people who remarry have better health than those who don't remarry. So again, it's another way of looking at how marriage is positive, and we've talked about that in prior chapters. In terms of economics and social class, and some of this is going to be sort of reiterated from earlier, with respect to straight marriage, and so we haven't seen yet comparable data for gay and lesbian marriages, but with respect to straight marriage, lower incomes of women and the tendency for women to live with their children after divorce dramatically reduces family income for single mothers. And so that contributes directly to what we call the feminization of poverty, where again, we're talking about the concentration of poverty among female-headed households. So research shows that women are more than twice as likely to be below the poverty line as men in the year after a divorce. Also, in terms of child well-being, there are some significant consequences with respect to divorce for children. So for children, often there can be increased stress or stressors with respect to going through a divorce. Often this involves, number one, less parental time and energy for children. Number two, if a child has uh, has much lower or less significant contact with one parent for longer than in the past, as well as if the child is part of conflict or part of witnessing parental conflict, that is obviously a stressor for that child or those children. And also the transitions. Often, what accompanies divorce are a myriad of transitions that involve home, community, work, school, and finances. And so, the ideal circumstance with respect to a divorcing couple would be to find ways to mitigate, to reduce the greater likelihood or the greater possibility of these kinds of stresses, particularly on children. And we also, in talking about divorce and remarriage, we also have to look at the possibility of blended families within this realm as well. Research shows generally about 2 out of 3 divorced people will remarry, and that's again perhaps a greater declaration of the economic and social benefits of marriage. However, the process of remarriage, particularly with respect to blended families, and so with that, we're talking about step parents and step siblings. So this process is often challenging, and so a lot of that has to do with the norms for remarriage and blended families being less clear. So in a way, that ill-defined or less defined social definition of a remarriage or a blended family, in a way, it's comparable, I would say, to the norms concerning cohabitation. And so we're looking at when you have that confusion, sometimes the confounding of norms, that, if you will, can be, again, a additional stressor for such families. And again, successful remarried families, successful blended families will find ways to meaningfully reduce the uncertainty and find ways to maximize clarity.